The hurricane roared, tearing through homes and flooding streets. In the chaos, elderly lives were trapped until search and rescue teams charged into the storm. On the US coast, a nursing home stood in the path of one of the deadliest hurricanes of the decade. As winds howled and floodwaters swallowed the city, the elderly residents found themselves prisoners of rising waters. Calls for help echoed into the night, but conditions worsened by the minute. Then came the call. Search and rescue teams would not let them face the storm alone. What followed was a battle of courage against nature itself. If you believe stories of courage should be told, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The Weather Service had been tracking Hurricane Miranda for days, watching as it strengthened from a Category 2 to a devastating Category 4 storm. By the time it made landfall on the southeastern coast, winds were clocking at over 130 miles per hour, with storm surge predictions reaching 15 feet. The coastal city of Cedar Bay had seen hurricanes before, but nothing quite like this. At the search and rescue headquarters, Captain Jake Morrison studied the radar with growing concern. Red and purple swirls dominated the screen, showing the monster storm's eye wall approaching fast. His team had been on standby for hours, equipment checked and double-checked, boats prepped and ready. They knew that once Miranda hit, there would be no time to hesitate. "Looks like we're in for a long night," Morrison said to his second-in-command, Lieutenant Sarah Chen. She nodded grimly, adjusting her waterproof gear. The radio crackled with emergency dispatches from across the city. Power lines were already down, streets flooding, and emergency calls were pouring in faster than they could be answered. Outside, the first bands of rain began hammering the station windows. The wind whistled through gaps in the building, a haunting sound that spoke of the destruction to come. Morrison's team consisted of 8 highly trained professionals, each with years of experience in water rescue operations. Tonight, they would need every bit of that training. The storm surge began its relentless march inland, turning streets into rivers and neighborhoods into islands. Cedar Bay's drainage system, designed for normal rainfall, was overwhelmed within the first hour. Cars floated like toys down what used to be Main Street, their hazard lights blinking desperately beneath the churning water. At Sunset Manor Nursing Home, located just 3 blocks from the coast, Administrator Helen Rodriguez watched the approaching storm with mounting dread. The facility housed 43 elderly residents, many with mobility issues, some bedridden. The building had been constructed to modern hurricane standards, but no structure was truly prepared for what Miranda was bringing ashore. The nursing home's backup generators hummed to life as the main power grid failed. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on the walls, while outside, palm trees bent almost horizontal against the wind. Rodriguez had evacuated nursing homes before, but never in conditions like these. The evacuation window had closed hours ago when the bridges became impassable and roads turned into rivers. Now, with floodwater already creeping into the building's lower level, she realized they were trapped. 43 vulnerable lives depended on walls and windows, holding against nature's fury, and Rodriguez wasn't sure they would be enough. She reached for her radio, knowing that somewhere in the storm, help would have to come from the outside. The first distress call would soon follow. By midnight, Hurricane Miranda had transformed Cedar Bay into an unrecognizable wasteland of water and wind. At Sunset Manor, the situation deteriorated rapidly as floodwater seeped through the foundation and began rising on the first floor. Helen Rodriguez moved quickly through the hallways, her flashlight beam cutting through the emergency lighting as she checked on residents. "Mrs. Patterson, we need to move you upstairs," she said gently to an 87-year-old woman in a wheelchair. The fear in the elderly woman's eyes was unmistakable, but she nodded bravely. Around them, the building groaned under the hurricane's assault. Windows rattled in their frames, and somewhere in the distance, glass shattered. The nursing staff worked frantically to relocate residents from the ground floor to the second level. Wheelchairs, walkers, and medical equipment had to be carried up narrow staircases while the building shook. For those unable to walk, the process was painstaking and exhausting. Every few minutes, another inch of water crept higher across the first floor. 80-year-old Frank Delacroix, a retired Navy veteran, watched from his second-floor window as the storm transformed his neighborhood. Trees that had stood for decades were uprooted like weeds. Cars bobbed in the rushing water below, their headlights creating an otherworldly underwater light show. "Seen plenty of storms at sea," he muttered to his roommate, "but nothing like this on dry land." The building's communication systems began failing one by one. The landline phones went dead first, then the internet connection. Rodriguez tried her cell phone repeatedly, but the towers were either down or overloaded. The nursing home's backup radio crackled with static, occasionally picking up fragments of emergency broadcasts from around the region. In the basement, the mechanical room was completely flooded. The backup generators, elevated on concrete platforms, continued running, but for how long remained uncertain. Rodriguez knew that without power, the medical equipment keeping several residents alive would fail. Time was becoming their enemy as much as the storm itself. 92-year-old Dorothy Chen sat in her wheelchair near the window, watching debris fly past like missiles in the wind. She had lived through the Great Depression, World War II, and countless challenges, but the raw power of Hurricane Miranda was unlike anything she had experienced. Her weathered hands gripped the armrests of her chair as the building shuddered under another powerful gust. The water on the first floor now reached knee-deep levels and continued rising steadily. Rodriguez realized that even the second floor might not be safe if the storm surge peaked as predicted. She made the difficult decision to attempt contact with emergency services, knowing that rescue teams were likely overwhelmed across the entire coastal region. As she reached for the emergency radio, another window downstairs exploded inward, sending glass and water cascading across the lobby. The elderly residents on the second floor could hear it clearly, the sound of their sanctuary slowly being torn apart by forces beyond human control. Help had to come soon, or it might not come at all. At 1:47 a.m., Helen Rodriguez finally made contact with emergency dispatch through the nursing home's backup radio. The connection was weak, filled with static and competing emergency calls from across the flooded city. She pressed the microphone close to her mouth, fighting to be heard over the storm's roar. "This is Sunset Manor Nursing Home on Coastal Drive," she transmitted urgently. "We have 43 elderly residents trapped by rising floodwater. Building is compromised, water rising fast. We need immediate evacuation assistance." The radio crackled back with fragments of response before cutting to static again. Meanwhile, at search and rescue headquarters, Captain Morrison and his team monitored multiple emergency channels simultaneously. The requests for help were overwhelming. Families trapped in attics, motorists stranded in submerged vehicles, apartment buildings with residents cut off by floodwater. Each call represented lives hanging in the balance. Lieutenant Chen plotted the emergency calls on a digital map, noting the locations and severity of each situation. When Rodriguez's transmission came through clearly for 30 seconds, Chen immediately flagged the nursing home as a priority rescue. 43 elderly residents in a compromised building. This was exactly the kind of situation that could turn from rescue to tragedy in minutes. "Captain, we've got Sunset Manor reporting critical situation," Chen announced. 43 elderly, building flooding, communications failing. Morrison studied the map, noting the nursing home's location in one of the hardest hit flood zones. The water there would be deep, the currents strong, and approaching by vehicle impossible. Rodriguez tried the radio again, her voice more desperate now. "Emergency services, Please respond. Water is now 3 feet deep on first floor. Several residents require life support equipment. We cannot evacuate on our own. Please, we need help immediately. This time, the transmission reached Morrison's team clearly. Back at Sunset Manor, the situation grew more dire by the hour. The backup generators continued running, but fuel levels were dropping. If power failed, the residents on oxygen concentrators and other vital medical equipment would be in immediate danger. The building's structural integrity was also becoming questionable as floodwater undermined the foundation. Resident Supervisor Maria Santos moved between rooms, checking on the 43 elderly residents now crowded onto the second floor. Many were frightened and confused, asking repeatedly when help would arrive. Santos offered reassurance she wasn't sure she believed herself, patting hands and speaking soothingly while her own anxiety mounted. Dorothy Chen, the 92-year-old by the window, had become an unofficial lookout. Despite her age, her eyes were sharp, and she scanned the flooded streets continuously for any sign of rescue vehicles. "There," she said suddenly, pointing into the storm. "I see lights moving out there." But the lights disappeared, swallowed by the rain and darkness. The radio in Rodriguez's hands crackled once more. Through the static came a voice that would change everything. "Sunset Manor. This is Search and Rescue Team Alpha. We have received your distress call. We are mobilizing for emergency evacuation. Hold your position and keep your radio open. Help is coming." For the first time in hours, Rodriguez felt a spark of hope. She pressed the radio to her mouth and responded, "Search and rescue. This is Sunset Manor. Thank God you received us. We'll be waiting. Please hurry. The water is still rising." Outside, Hurricane Miranda continued its assault. But somewhere in the storm, brave souls were preparing to risk everything for people they had never met. Captain Morrison called his team to immediate action stations at 2:15 a.m. The Sunset Manor distress call had elevated from priority to critical status, as reports indicated the building's first floor was nearly completely submerged. 8 search and rescue specialists gathered around the tactical map as Morrison outlined their emergency response plan. Water levels in that sector are running 8 to 10 feet deep with strong currents, Morrison explained, his finger tracing the flooded streets leading to the nursing home. "Normal vehicle access is impossible. We're going in with the high water rescue boats, but conditions are going to be brutal out there." Lieutenant Sarah Chen double-checked the team's specialized equipment: high-powered floodlights, medical emergency kits, communication gear, rope systems, and flotation devices designed for elderly and disabled evacuees. Each team member wore full water rescue gear, helmets with mounted lights, waterproof radios, and life vests rated for extreme conditions. Rescue specialist Marcus Webb, a veteran of Hurricane Katrina operations, loaded additional medical supplies. He knew that elderly evacuees might suffer from hypothermia, shock, or complications from existing medical conditions. "We need to assume some of these folks are going to be in bad shape," he told his teammates. "Exposure, medications running out, stress-induced medical episodes." The team's 2 specialized rescue boats were designed for exactly these conditions. Shallow draft hulls that could navigate flooded streets, powerful spotlights for night operations, and stable platforms for loading evacuees safely. But even these purpose-built vessels would be challenged by Hurricane Miranda's conditions. Weather reports continued to worsen. Wind gusts were now exceeding 140 miles per hour, with embedded tornadoes reported in several areas. The storm surge had peaked at 17 feet, 3 feet higher than predicted, turning most of the coastal district into an inland sea. Debris in the water included everything from cars to entire rooftops torn from buildings. Morrison gathered his team for final briefing. We've done operations in Category 4 conditions before, but this is extreme even for us. Visibility is near zero, currents are unpredictable, and we've got electrical hazards from downed power lines. Everyone stays attached to safety lines at all times. Rescue swimmer Elena Rodriguez, no relation to the nursing home administrator, had experience evacuating elderly residents from previous disasters. She understood the unique challenges. Many would be frightened, some might be confused or have dementia, and physical limitations would make standard evacuation procedures difficult or impossible. The radio crackled with an update from Sunset Manor. Helen Rodriguez's voice came through clearly. Search and rescue. Water has now reached the second floor. We've moved all residents to the highest rooms, but we're running out of safe space. Several residents are experiencing breathing difficulties, and our backup power is becoming unstable. Morrison keyed his radio immediately. Sunset Manor. We are launching now. ETA, approximately 25 minutes to your location. Continue monitoring this frequency and prepare residents for evacuation. We're coming to get you. As the team prepared to launch into the storm, each member understood the stakes. 43 elderly lives depended on their ability to navigate deadly conditions and execute a complex evacuation under the worst possible circumstances. They had trained for scenarios like this their entire careers, but training never fully prepared anyone for the raw fury of a Category 4 hurricane. Webb checked his watch, 2:43 a.m. Sunrise was still hours away, meaning the entire operation would take place in darkness, with only their mounted lights to penetrate the storm. He looked at his teammates and saw the same determination he felt himself. They would not let those elderly residents face the hurricane alone. At 2:51 a.m., Search and Rescue Team Alpha launched their boats into what used to be Cedar Bay's downtown district. The transformation was shocking. Familiar streets had become raging rivers, with water flowing at dangerous speeds between half-submerged buildings. Captain Morrison piloted the lead boat while Lieutenant Chen navigated using GPS and local knowledge of the area's pre-flood geography. The two rescue boats cut through the turbulent water, their powerful engines fighting against currents that would have swept away smaller vessels. Debris constantly threatened their progress. Street signs, parts of buildings, vehicles rolling underwater like deadly bowling balls. Team member Marcus Webb used a long pole to push away floating hazards while keeping watch for electrical lines that might still be energized. "Jesus, look at that!" Elena Rodriguez shouted over the wind, pointing to a two-story house with only its roof visible above the flood line. Throughout the journey to Sunset Manor, they passed similar scenes of devastation, an entire community swallowed by the storm surge and Hurricane Miranda's relentless rainfall. Communication with the nursing home had become intermittent as the storm intensified. When Rodriguez's voice did break through the static, her updates grew increasingly urgent. Water is now 18 inches deep on second floor. We've moved residents to the highest rooms available. Some are showing signs of hypothermia. Please hurry. The rescue boat's high-intensity spotlights swept across the flooded landscape, occasionally illuminating other survivors who waved desperately from upper-floor windows. Morrison made the difficult decision to maintain course toward the nursing home. 43 elderly lives had to take priority, but each past opportunity to help others weighed heavily on the team. Navigating proved more challenging than expected. Street signs were underwater, familiar landmarks destroyed or obscured by debris. Chen used building shapes and the few remaining elevated structures to guide their approach to Coastal Drive. The GPS showed their position, but the reality of the flooded terrain bore little resemblance to the map's street layout. "There," Webb called out, his light beam catching a partially submerged street sign. "Coastal Drive, 2 blocks ahead." But as they turned toward the nursing home's location, they encountered the strongest currents yet. The water flowed like a river between the buildings, carrying massive debris that could crush their boats if they weren't careful. Rescue swimmer Elena Rodriguez prepared the specialized evacuation equipment while Morrison fought to maintain position against the current. The elderly residents would need flotation devices, blankets for warmth, and careful handling to prevent injury during transfer from building to boat. Each evacuation would require multiple team members and precious time. When Sunset Manor finally came into view, the sight was sobering. The single-story section of the building was completely submerged, with only the two-story main structure visible above the floodline. Water lapped at second-floor windows, and they could see flashlight beams moving behind the glass. The residents and staff were still alive, but trapped in an increasingly dangerous situation. Morrison keyed his radio. "Sunset Manor, this is Search and Rescue Team Alpha. We are on scene and preparing for evacuation. We can see your lights. How many residents are ambulatory versus requiring assistance?" Helen Rodriguez's voice came back immediately, filled with relief and exhaustion. "Search and rescue, thank God you're here. We have 8 residents who can walk with assistance, 12 in wheelchairs, and 23 who are bedridden or require carrying. Several are on oxygen concentrators running on backup power." The team exchanged glances. This would be a massive undertaking under perfect conditions. In hurricane-force winds and rising floodwater, it would test every skill they possessed. But there was no hesitation. They had come this far, and 43 lives were counting on them. Morrison maneuvered the boat toward the building as his team prepared for the most challenging rescue operation of their careers. Morrison brought the lead rescue boat alongside Sunset Manor at 3:34 a.m., fighting constant wind and water pressure to maintain position. The building's second-floor windows were now less than 3 feet above the floodline, and water continued rising steadily. Elena Rodriguez secured the boat to a sturdy window frame, while Webb prepared the entry equipment. "Hello inside," Chen called through her radio and by shouting toward the windows. "Search and rescue is here. We're going to get everyone out safely." Almost immediately, flashlight beams appeared at multiple windows, and they could hear voices, some crying with relief, others calling out medical needs and urgent requests. Helen Rodriguez appeared at the main window, her face showing the strain of the last several hours. "Thank God you're here," she said as Webb helped her open the window fully. "We have critical situations. 3 residents whose oxygen concentrators are failing as our backup power fluctuates, and several showing signs of severe distress." The team quickly established their evacuation protocol. Morrison would maintain boat position against the current, while Chen coordinated the evacuation sequence. Rodriguez and Webb would enter the building to assess each resident and prepare them for transfer. The second boat, piloted by team member David Park, positioned nearby to receive evacuees. Rodriguez climbed through the window first, immediately struck by the crowded conditions inside. 43 elderly residents, plus nursing staff, were packed into the building's highest rooms. The air was thick with anxiety, medical equipment hummed constantly, and the sound of rising water could be heard beneath everything else. "I'm Elena Rodriguez with Search and Rescue," she announced to the room. "We're here to get everyone to safety. We need to prioritize based on medical needs first." Helen Rodriguez quickly briefed her on each resident's condition: who needed oxygen, who couldn't walk, who might panic during the transfer process. 92-year-old Dorothy Chen was among the first to greet the rescuer. Despite her age, her eyes were bright and alert. "Young lady," she said firmly, "you take the sick ones first. I've been watching that water rise and we don't have much time." Her matter-of-fact assessment proved accurate. Water was now visible, seeping under the second-floor doors. The first evacuee was Mrs. Patterson, the 87-year-old wheelchair user from Chapter 2. She was experiencing breathing difficulties and needed immediate medical attention. Webb carefully lifted her while Rodriguez secured a flotation device designed for elderly evacuees. The transfer from window to boat required precise coordination as the wind tried to push everyone off balance. "Easy, Mrs. Patterson," Rodriguez said gently as they lowered her into the boat. "You're going to be fine. We're going to take good care of you." Despite her fear, Mrs. Patterson managed a weak smile. The first successful transfer gave everyone, residents, staff, and rescuers, a surge of hope. But as they prepared the second evacuee, a bedridden resident with multiple medical conditions, the challenges became clear. This operation would require hours they might not have, as water continued its relentless rise toward the second-floor ceiling. Each transfer took precious minutes, and 42 more lives waited their turn. Frank Delacroix, the retired Navy veteran, refused evacuation initially. "Take the ladies first," he insisted. "Take the ones who can't help themselves. I can wait." His military bearing remained intact, even as fear showed in his eyes. The search and rescue team found themselves not just fighting the hurricane, but managing the courage and dignity of people facing their mortality. If this story has you hooked so far, subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments what you would do in their place. By 4:15 a.m., the search and rescue team had established an efficient but painstaking evacuation rhythm. Each elderly resident required individual assessment and customized transfer techniques. Webb and Rodriguez worked inside the building, while Morrison and Chen managed the boat operations. But the rising water was becoming everyone's enemy. The most challenging evacuations involved bedridden residents who required careful lifting and specialized flotation support. 85-year-old Robert Martinez, a stroke survivor with limited mobility, needed 3 team members to transfer him safely from bed to boat. His wife of 62 years, Carmen, refused to leave without him, creating emotional complexity alongside the physical challenges. "Ma'am, we need to get you both out together," Rodriguez explained patiently to Carmen Martinez. "But we have to do this systematically to keep everyone safe." The elderly woman finally agreed, but only after Webb assured her that her husband would be in the boat before she was transferred. Elena Rodriguez found herself drawing on training she'd never expected to need. Not just water rescue techniques, but geriatric care knowledge. Many residents were disoriented by the chaos. Some had dementia and didn't understand what was happening, and others were experiencing medical crises triggered by stress and exposure to cold water. Frank Delacroix, the Navy veteran, proved invaluable during the evacuation process. Despite being 80 years old, he helped calm other residents and assisted with organizing the evacuation sequence. "Ma'am," he told Rodriguez, "I've seen plenty of scared sailors in my time. These folks just need to know someone's in charge who knows what they're doing." The building's structural integrity was deteriorating rapidly. Windows on the north side began failing under wind pressure, and the sound of debris hitting the exterior walls was constant and violent. The backup generator finally failed at 4:47 a.m., plunging the building into darkness except for the rescuers' lights and emergency flashlights. Dorothy Chen, still serving as unofficial lookout despite being 92, spotted a critical development. "The water's coming up faster now," she announced. "It's reached the hallway outside." Indeed, floodwater was now seeping under doors throughout the second floor, and the building's highest safe areas were shrinking rapidly. Morrison made the decision to bring the second rescue boat directly to the building's other side, allowing simultaneous evacuations from multiple windows. This doubled their evacuation capacity, but required splitting the team's resources and coordination. Each boat could safely carry 6 to 8 elderly evacuees at a time, meaning multiple trips would be necessary. During one particularly difficult transfer, resident supervisor Maria Santos slipped on the wet window frame and nearly fell into the flood. Webb caught her, But the near accident highlighted how dangerous conditions were becoming for everyone involved. Exhaustion was setting in for both rescuers and nursing staff after hours of intensive physical work. "How many more?" Chen asked during a brief pause between transfers. Helen Rodriguez consulted her clipboard, now soggy and barely readable. 18 residents still inside, plus 4 staff members who insisted on staying until everyone else was out. The numbers were encouraging. They had successfully evacuated 25 elderly residents, but time was running out. As if to emphasize the urgency, another section of first-floor ceiling collapsed below them, sending vibrations through the entire building. The structure that had sheltered these vulnerable residents was slowly being destroyed by Hurricane Miranda's relentless assault, and the race between rising water and successful evacuation was becoming desperately close. Webb looked at Rodriguez as they prepared for another transfer. Both were exhausted, soaked, and battered by hours of fighting the storm, but neither hesitated. 18 more lives were depending on them, and failure was not an option. At 5:23 a.m., Hurricane Miranda seemed to intensify its assault on Sunset Manor, just as the rescue operation reached its most critical phase. Wind gusts now exceeded 150 miles per hour, making boat handling nearly impossible and putting everyone at extreme risk. The search and rescue team had evacuated 31 of the 43 residents, but exhaustion was taking its toll on everyone. Elena Rodriguez felt the strain in every muscle as she helped transfer another bedridden resident. Her waterproof gear was torn in several places. Her helmet light had been damaged by flying debris, and her hands were raw from constant gripping of wet ropes and safety equipment. But when she looked into the frightened eyes of 89-year-old Helen Kowalski, she found strength she didn't know she still possessed. "We're almost done, Mrs. Kowalski," Rodriguez said gently, securing the flotation device around the elderly woman's frail body. "Just a short boat ride, and you'll be somewhere warm and dry." Mrs. Kowalski, who had been mostly silent throughout the evacuation, gripped Rodriguez's hand with surprising strength and whispered, "You're an angel, dear." Captain Morrison fought to maintain boat position as debris strikes became more frequent and violent. A section of someone's roof had lodged against the nursing home, creating additional hazards, and the water level inside the building was now approaching waist-deep. The remaining 12 residents and 4 staff members were crowded into the building's highest room, standing on furniture to stay above the rising flood. Marcus Webb, working inside the building, was showing signs of severe exhaustion. He had been lifting and carrying elderly residents for over 2 hours in increasingly dangerous conditions. During the transfer of wheelchair-bound resident James Morrison, no relation to the captain, Webb stumbled and nearly dropped both himself and the evacuee into the flood. Only Elena Rodriguez's quick intervention prevented disaster. "Marcus, you need to rotate out," Rodriguez told him firmly, but Webb shook his head stubbornly. 12 more people," he replied. "I can do 12 more." His dedication was admirable, but Rodriguez could see he was reaching the point where exhaustion might cause accidents that could cost lives. Frank Delacroix, the Navy veteran, remained one of the final residents awaiting evacuation. At 80 years old, he had insisted that every other resident be evacuated first, helping organize the process and keeping spirits up with stories and jokes despite the danger. Now standing in knee-deep water inside the building, his military discipline was as strong as ever. "Son," he said to Webb, "in the Navy we learned that a good sailor knows when to rest so he can fight another day. You've done enough carrying to last a lifetime." But even as he spoke, Delacroix was helping support another resident who was showing signs of hypothermia after hours of exposure to cold floodwater. The nursing home structure was failing rapidly. The main support beam in the common room cracked with a sound like gunfire, and a section of exterior wall showed visible movement under the hurricane's pressure. Helen Rodriguez, the administrator, made the difficult decision to abandon the building's lower level completely and concentrate everyone in the single highest room. David Park, piloting the second rescue boat, reported dangerous conditions across the entire flood zone. "We're seeing buildings collapse 6 blocks south," he radioed to Morrison. "Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it fast. The storm surge is still rising, and we're getting reports of levee failures upstream." As Rodriguez prepared to evacuate Dorothy Chen, the 92-year-old lookout, who had been their eyes throughout the night, the elderly woman made an observation that chilled everyone. "Dear," she said quietly, "I don't think this building is going to last much longer. You can feel it swaying in the wind." She was right. The structure that had protected these residents for hours was beginning to fail just as the rescue operation entered its final phase. 12 more lives to save, and time had become the most precious resource of all. At 6:07 a.m., dawn began to break over the flooded landscape, revealing the full scope of Hurricane Miranda's destruction. But for the search and rescue team at Sunset Manor, sunrise brought urgency rather than relief. The building was visibly unstable. Water had reached chest-deep levels inside, and 8 elderly residents, plus 4 nursing staff, remained trapped in the highest room. Elena Rodriguez made the decision to stay inside the collapsing building while her teammates worked from the boats. "I'm not leaving until the last person is out," she declared, wading through the rising water to reach the remaining evacuees. Her dedication inspired everyone, residents, staff, and fellow rescuers alike. Frank Delacroix, despite being among the final evacuees, continued helping others. He supported Dorothy Chen, whose 92-year-old body was showing signs of severe exhaustion and hypothermia. "Come on, sweetheart," he said gently. "Time to get you somewhere warm." Even facing his own evacuation, the Navy veteran put others first. The building's collapse was accelerating. Windows on the east wall began failing systematically under wind pressure, and the sound of structural elements breaking was constant. Morrison knew they had minutes, not hours, before the entire structure might come down. He pushed the rescue boat's engines to maximum power, fighting currents and debris to maintain position. Marcus Webb, despite his exhaustion, found a second wind for the final evacuations. He and Rodriguez worked together to transfer the most fragile remaining residents, including 2 who were unconscious and required constant medical monitoring. Each transfer was performed with meticulous care, even as water lapped at their chests and the building shuddered around them. Dorothy Chen proved to be one of the most challenging evacuations. At 92, she had served as their eyes and ears throughout the night, but now she was barely conscious and couldn't assist with her own transfer. Rodriguez and Webb lifted her with extraordinary gentleness, treating her like the precious human treasure she was. "Ma'am, you've been our guardian angel tonight," Rodriguez whispered to Chen as they secured her flotation device. "Now let us take care of you." Despite her weakened condition, Chen managed a small smile and squeezed Rodriguez's hand in acknowledgement. Helen Rodriguez, the nursing home administrator, insisted on being evacuated last along with her remaining staff. She had maintained a careful count throughout the night and was determined to personally verify that every single resident was safely removed. 43 residents came into this storm with us," she said firmly. 43 residents are leaving with us." At 6:41 a.m., Frank Delacroix became the final resident evacuated from Sunset Manor. The 80-year-old Navy veteran maintained his dignity and composure even as Webb and Elena Rodriguez helped him through the window into the rescue boat. "Thank you," he said simply to Morrison, "for not leaving us behind." The final transfer was Helen Rodriguez herself, along with the last 3 nursing staff members who had refused to leave their residence. As Rodriguez climbed into the rescue boat, she looked back at the building that had been home to 43 vulnerable elderly people. Water was now at the second-floor ceiling level, and the structure was visibly unstable. "Everyone accounted for?" Morrison asked. Helen Rodriguez consulted her soggy clipboard one final time, checking names against faces in the rescue boats. 43 residents, 6 staff members, all present and safe, she confirmed. At that moment, a section of Sunset Manor's roof collapsed into the flood with a tremendous crash. They had made it. Every single life had been saved from Hurricane Miranda's fury. As the 2 rescue boats carrying 49 survivors pulled away from the collapsing Sunset Manor, the full magnitude of what had been accomplished began to sink in. Captain Morrison navigated through the debris-filled floodwater toward the emergency shelter that had been established at Cedar Bay High School, one of the few buildings in the area constructed on elevated ground above the storm surge. Elena Rodriguez sat among the elderly evacuees, monitoring their conditions and providing comfort. Many were in shock, some showed signs of hypothermia, and all were exhausted from their ordeal. But they were alive. Frank Delacroix, wrapped in an emergency blanket, looked around at his fellow survivors with quiet satisfaction. "Not bad for a night's work," he said to Dorothy Chen, who was resting against his shoulder. The evacuation had taken over 4 hours of continuous work in hurricane conditions. The search and rescue team had battled winds exceeding 150 miles per hour, navigated through deadly debris fields, and carried out complex medical evacuations while a building collapsed around them. Every team member was physically and emotionally drained, but none had given up. At the emergency shelter, medical personnel immediately began treating the evacuees. Several residents required IV fluids for dehydration. Others needed treatment for minor injuries and exposure effects. But remarkably, all 43 elderly residents had survived their encounter with Hurricane Miranda. The nursing staff, led by Helen Rodriguez, continued caring for their residents even at the shelter. Dorothy Chen, despite being 92 years old and having endured hours in rising floodwater, proved to be one of the most resilient survivors. She insisted on walking into the shelter under her own power and immediately began comforting other residents who were still frightened or disoriented. "We made it, dears," she told them repeatedly. "We all made it." Marcus Webb collapsed into a chair at the shelter, finally allowing exhaustion to overtake his adrenaline. He had personally lifted or assisted with over 30 elderly evacuees during the night, working far beyond normal physical limits. Elena Rodriguez, equally exhausted, sat beside him, and for the first time in hours, allowed herself to smile. 43 lives, she said quietly to Webb. "When we started tonight, I wasn't sure we could pull it off." Webb nodded, too tired for many words, but deeply satisfied. They had faced one of the most challenging rescue scenarios possible and succeeded completely. Helen Rodriguez addressed the group of evacuees at the shelter. "I want everyone to know that what happened tonight was extraordinary," she said. "These search and rescue heroes risked their own lives to save each and every one of you. They never gave up, never left anyone behind, and never stopped fighting for us." Captain Morrison completed his post-mission report as Hurricane Miranda finally moved inland, its power diminishing as it lost contact with warm ocean water. The storm had caused massive damage across the coastal region, but at Sunset Manor, the story was different. Through courage, skill, and determination, every vulnerable life had been preserved. Frank Delacroix approached Morrison before the search and rescue team departed for their next assignment. The 80-year-old Navy veteran extended his weathered hand to the captain. "Sailor to sailor," he said with deep respect, "that was the finest rescue operation I've ever witnessed. You and your team are the reason 43 families still have their loved ones today." In the days that followed, as floodwater receded and the community began rebuilding, the story of the Sunset Manor evacuation became a symbol of hope. Local news stations covered the rescue extensively, but for the search and rescue team, the real reward was simpler. 43 Christmas cards the following December, 43 birthday wishes throughout the year, and the knowledge that when nature unleashed its worst, human courage had prevailed. Dorothy Chen, fully recovered and relocated to a new facility, kept a photograph of the search and rescue team on her bedside table. When visitors asked about it, she would smile and say, "Those are my guardian angels. They charged into a hurricane to save us old folks. Courage like that doesn't come along every day." Elena Rodriguez returned to duty the next week, her equipment repaired and her spirit renewed. She carried with her the memory of Mrs. Kowalski, calling her an angel, of Frank Delacroix's unwavering dignity, and of Dorothy Chen's indomitable spirit. These memories would fuel her dedication through countless future rescues. The Sunset Manor building was eventually demolished, too damaged by Hurricane Miranda to be salvaged. But what happened there during those crucial hours became part of the community's permanent memory, a testament to the truth that courage isn't a choice, it's a calling. And when that calling comes, some people answer without hesitation, standing between life and death with one purpose: to save lives. As the sun set on Cedar Bay weeks later, with reconstruction underway and the community healing, the lighthouse that had guided ships safely to harbor for over a century was restored to working order. Its beams swept across the waters where Hurricane Miranda had raged, now calm and peaceful once again. Somewhere in that light, the courage of those who serve others continued to shine, ready for the next call, the next storm, the next opportunity to prove that no life is expendable when heroes are willing to answer the call. If this story moved you, subscribe, turn on the bell, and share your thoughts in the comments.